website and check out some of the stuff that we do. I've got some classes on Pluralsight, which you should also check out. A lot of good stuff there. I teach also part-time at DSU, which is really cool. Former NSA, former CTO. I got some pictures of random stuff on the screen. It's kind of cool, right? Nice icons. So, woo! All right, so with the background stuff out of the way, what's today's talk about? Well, first, just briefly, this is like a pen tester's con, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of unique, right? Years ago, there really wasn't such a thing, right? If you're an old fart like me and you started going to DEF CON and Black Hat back in 2001, all the cons were really more security research oriented. It's not until just the last probably 6 years that there was a con that's really, kind of focused on pen testing. So all that to say, that's cool. And I probably don't need to go into the detail of what a typical pen test looks like. A lot of you probably already know. So I'll just mention it very briefly. And then what some of the differences of what, if you see an embedded system and how that would fit into, say, a typical corporate pen test. And give some examples and, of course, recommendations at the end on how we can all do better. So a typical pen test, if you haven't done it and you haven't been coming to this conference for a long time, would include things like an external audit, where you kind of try to hack into the company from the outside in through servers with vulnerabilities and whatever else, or apps. An internal pen test, so once you're in, what do? You find all the stuff, hack all the things. There's probably a song about that, I think. Wireless audits, social engineering, all really cool stuff. Physical pen testing, social engineering, all that good stuff. It's really, really fun stuff. That's kind of the typical stuff that a pen test includes. And what's interesting about that is that it probably doesn't include the building controller, the HVAC system, and maybe the camera system, and some of the other stuff because that's not owned by the IT director, right? They don't, he didn't have that stuff installed. Maybe doesn't even know about that stuff. That was put in by the facilities people. And the facilities people aren't technologists, but they hired it out to a third-party company who put in the camera systems and the building controller and, all that stuff. So it's really cool. Nothing wrong with that, right? Well, the problem is a lot of that stuff's not very secure. And so that's kind of what we'll talk about in the talk. Is just some funny things that we've noticed while we do pen test. Are some of those systems and some of the vulnerabilities in them. They're kind of interesting and humorous. But what's not so funny is that a lot of times you have kind of that, well, that's not my problem, sort of mindset, right? Where the person who's in charge of IT or security is like, well, I'm not going to pay to get a pen test done on the building controller because that's not in my budget. That's not my problem. Well, whose problem is it then, right? So that in itself is a problem. So the takeaway there is really all technology and the security of all technology does need to flow through the CISO, right? Somebody needs to be the buck has to stop somewhere for all that stuff. Otherwise, when it hits the news and the media and there's a major breach, whether you thought it was your problem or not, if you're the CISO, you're still going to get fired probably, right? Or you're going to have to retire, whichever comes first. So it is your problem, whether you know it or not. And so that's kind of, one of the obvious takeaways there. So, in terms of who should test that then, when it comes to those embedded systems, IoT, all that stuff, one of the obvious things is the manufacturer should pen test that, right? They should write it securely and it should be safe, and so it's their problem. That's the idea. Well, true, and they need to do more, right? But it's still not strictly their problem. It still has to be installed right. It still needs to be monitored and managed by IT. So there's a lot that needs to get done on all sides of that, right? So there's a real cooperative effect that needs to take place for this to be done well. So as a buyer, you could ask your sales rep, hey, that building controller you're trying to sell me, tell me about the SDLC. What do you know about secure development lifecycle? Do your developers follow that? And they'll look at you like, huh? And you won't get any, it'll be a completely unfruitful, unproductive conversation because they won't know what you're talking about. And so that's part of the problem too. Not enough people know about this stuff, right? And so that's kind of bad. Unless you're a hacker, then it's kind of good. But we're taking this talk from sort of the good guys approach, from trying to be safe. So what are some of the differences then in IoT, embedded systems, SCADA, building controllers compared to typical IT? Some of them are good. And so I'm not down on IoT, by the way, at all. Some people are like, oh, IoT is going to ruin the world because it's, it's really insecure and we're all going to die and stuff like that. I don't really have that approach. I'm kind of optimistic just in general. I think one of the things that's sweet about IoT is it's really one of the most disruptive technologies since the internet, right? The internet was very disruptive. It changed the way the world works. IoT will do that same thing. Give me an example. Okay. An example of that might be, suppose that there's a snowstorm on its way, and you live in the north, and you have a snowblower, and the spark plug in your snowblower is about to go bad, and Lowe's calls you up and says, hey, we noticed that your snowblower is telling us that your spark plug's about to go bad. You should come in and buy a new one. They're only $2, and you'll be safe during the snowstorm that way. Like, that technology doesn't really exist yet. I don't think there's IoT in snowblowers, but like that's the kind of thing that's coming, right? With smart fridges and smart snow throwers and like all that stuff is really cool. Like that has the ability to transform our life in a whole new way. When your vendor can tell you that you're about to burn your cake or you're about to not have a good day with your snow thrower or whatever, that's pretty cool. So the positive potential for any tool, right, is always there. Whether it's a hammer or whatever else, you can use that for good or you could kill somebody with a hammer, right? And so we see that with IoT, that it has huge positive implications. Then again, on the flip side, if you're sort of pessimistic and, kind of like many of us in the room tend to be a little bit at times because we've been in security a long time, you sort of see things from the other side and you're like, well, but that's a huge privacy concern. Do I really want Lowe's to know about my snow thrower? And like, oh, by the way, do they audit that code? And oh, by the way, somebody can hack my snow thrower and like, make it run and cut my leg off or something. Or like, that's one of the crazy things about IoT is that hacking used to be about taking, right? It's like, I'll hack you and I will take your stuff, your credit cards and your social security number and all that stuff. And that's really bad. But with IoT came the possibility of like, I'll reach through the internet and I will kill you. I'll touch you. I'll burn your house down. I'll do whatever, right? Like that's new. IoT brings that. That's a new thing that didn't really exist before. And that's really scary, right? That's, oh no. And it's particularly bad when a lot of these systems aren't nearly as secure as they could be. Because the camera, your IoT-enabled camera has to sell for like $50. And it comes, from the cheapest vendor possible overseas or whatever. So what we see a lot of default creds in these kind of things. Probably one of the single biggest vulnerabilities in the internet right now, believe it or not, after 20 years of, talking about this, is default creds, especially right now, right? The Mariah botnet and a lot of other things we saw came from that idea that there's just these credentials we know about for this server, for this system, for this camera, for this building controller, for this thing. We can just log in and do crazy stuff. And you're like, yeah, it's boring, default creds. Maybe. But what's new about the whole thing is that now you can do weird things at scale that you never used to be able to do, right? And we'll see some of that. We'll see some of that. The Mariah botnet was probably one of the biggest examples of that. You can create a whole army of computers by sort of automating this logging in with default creds and doing something with an army of stuff. So you can do stuff at scale. It's not just you can peekaboo on one person, right? So it's a backdoor. And it was there for a reason traditionally in many of these systems, right? When you think about like a building controller or something like that, something for your heating and cooling or something, because they didn't used to be on the internet. So when the guy with the tool belt showed up and he was going to plug into this thing with his laptop, like he needed to know the user and pass to, fix your air conditioning. And it was good that he knew that so that he could do his job, right? So there was a kind of legitimate reason for that. The problem is like, I'm not a repairman, right? Or whatever. And yet we know the default credentials too. So that's not a good thing. Okay, so one of the things that makes any embedded system a little scary in some sense too is that sometimes those vulnerabilities will hide for a while too, right? When you think about your automobile or that SCADA system or whatever, because sometimes a lot of people are like, well, I could hack on my car, but like, I take my wife and kids to school in that too. Like if I screw up the brakes, we might die. Like, so maybe I won't hack on my car. I'll reverse yet another Windows binary or something like that, right? Because it's easier, it's safer, I know how to do it. It's in a workflow I understand. I'm gonna leave my car alone, right? And I think that happens a lot, and that's fine. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, except for the security community is, in some cases, a little more reluctant. That's changing. We see a lot more auto work. We see a lot more embedded systems work, but traditionally, it's a little harder to get your hands on some of that stuff. The other thing that's kind of just terrifying is this idea that this realization that, man, all this code is just, we can't seem to secure it, right? We can't seem to get our arms around it. No matter what they do, just take Windows, for example. Windows 10 is so secure in some ways, right? It has all these crazy mitigations to stop memory corruption vulnerabilities, and it does a pretty good job at that. And yet people are still hacking it because all you have to do is phish a user and ask them for the user pass, and they'll give it to you, and you can get onto their system, right? So it's like you can't stop all the different types of vulnerabilities there are. And so there's always this need for detection, which is cool. I mean, like, so all of you in the room, you all have job security. Like, there'll always be a job there for you. That's cool. Like, in a way, that's neat. But like, I don't want to put like McAfee on my car. You know what I mean? Like, who wants to like? You're gonna have to put AV on everything. Like, that's really, the idea that you might buy a brand new Ford and then the Ford dealer says, oh, and by the way, if you want your Ford secure, you have to pay an extra $200 to get like security software put on. It's like, oh, really? Man, try to explain that to my grandparents. They're dead, but it'd be harder. But anyway, it's going to be a tough sell, right? So, all right. One of the other things that's interesting is that, like I said, there's a chance for physical effects. There's also a chance that your hacking will be lesser noticed too, right? Because your IT people don't necessarily own that embedded system or that camera system, or whatever. So they're probably not monitoring either. It probably doesn't report its log to the SIM. It probably, you know what I mean? It's probably not getting updated. There's a lot of problems around the monitoring and the management and the security of that whole device. So cyber war just got real, right? It was already real. Now it's realer. Okay, so sometimes when we do these pen tests and stuff, we see some really interesting things, and we want to have a deeper look. And sometimes we have time, sometimes we don't. But either way, some of the things we run into a lot are like cameras, like I said, the building management controllers, and so many other systems. You could, find these kind of things all day long, IoT type things, embedded, home routers, and whatever else you want, all these things. One particular system that we see quite often, at least around us, is this exact vision camera system. And it's a system we've seen before, and when you find it, and it's not that hard to find on the internet, all you have to do is basically click on that left box there, and you get a view like this, as long as you know the default credentials, which we know. They're easy to find out. If you don't know, you can do some Googling and find them out. Now, the vendor will tell you, like, okay, that's been fixed in the very most recent version of the system. Like, we now enforce password changes and stuff like that. Most of these type of systems, they'll tell you that. The problem is a lot of these like building controllers and expensive camera systems and stuff, they were sold as an expensive item that was meant to last a long time. So you're going to find very few customers using the latest and greatest, and a lot of customers using old stuff, right? So there's a lot of very vulnerable systems out there. And so, oh man, you got to kind of look into it and try to figure out who the actual vendor is and figure out how to report it. It's a big pain. That's actually a system that manages other cameras. So all these other cameras fit into this camera system. And it's pretty easy to find these things on the internet. You can go to a little thing called Shodan. If you haven't heard of what Shodan is, it does things that are not really revelational in our field, right? It basically like port scans or Nmaps systems, and then you can figure out that, oh, there's this IP address with, this like string, and it's whatever web server, and it has these ports open. Okay, boring. We did that 20 years ago, right? Wrong. What's really interesting about Shodan is basically what's really cool about it is they've done that for you, so you don't have to do that. Yes, we could have done that 10 or 20 years ago, but now you don't have to. You can just go to this portal, put in what you're looking for, and it's like, here's the list of things that meet that criteria. So it's like pre-calculated, basically, right? And as an attacker, that helps you greatly because you can sort of anonymously find these things without having to put any fingerprints out on the internet, right? So that's cool. It's really neat. You can really find these things, and you can really log into them. And you can really find lots of information. Some of these systems are grossly vulnerable. Not only like with some of these camera systems, it's not just a matter of being able to peekaboo through their cameras, right? Which, if you're a creeper, if you are a pervert of any kind, like you were born at the right time. This is your day. This is your time to shine. Because there are a lot of these on the internet. Hopefully you know I'm kidding. I actually think it's terrible. I'm just mortified that you can find so many of these kind of things. But like literally, this is your day, right? You can even do stuff like conduct military missions or something through just cameras that are already open. You could maybe look at a port and see that Navy ships come in and out at certain times of day because there's just cameras on the internet that are open that you can just look through. Like you used to have to go and take pictures from a car window if you're an FBI agent or something. Like people do that for you now, right? They put it on Facebook. There's cameras on the internet. Like you just they do the work for you. That's awesome. I love that. So there's a lot of other stuff about these systems that you can find out. I mean, you can log into some of these and you're like into the car dealer. And what I love about this, you ever have that situation where your car's in the shop and, they're like, oh, hey, we won't be able to get to your car till like next Friday because we're completely booked, we're slammed, all the bays are filled up. And you're like, ain't nothing going on in your garage. The first 4 bays are empty. Come on. Tell me the truth. Get to work on my car. Yeah, so these are, I probably should have sanitized those a little more, but these are like real systems. Sorry, it is what it is. Yeah, people need to know about this, right? Somebody needs to know that this stuff is out there and they're easy to find and that you can like add users to these systems and you can like watch cows get born if you're into that. And I'm not into that. I'm not saying I'm not into that, but do what you need to do. You can check out solar fields and, these systems are expensive. So if you're not a creeper, maybe you just want free software. There's license keys out there, It's like, there's a $10,000 key. Okay, cool, I'll grab that. Oh, by the way, it runs an old version of Windows 7. Interesting. Maybe we could hack it in some other way. Okay, so, look at all the cameras attached to this system. They have old versions of their firmware. Maybe the cameras have vulnerabilities too. Interesting. But I changed the password, so I'm okay now. I changed the password, so the system's safe. That's good. Maybe. Although this system's a little odd. You can actually still attach to it even without the password. You just can't see the camera views, which is a little weird. So you're still on their network, their internal network. Why is their camera system on the internet? I have no idea. We did one job, and after the job, we asked the principal in charge of it. It was for a school system. We're like, why was your camera system on the internet? By the way, we could see students like camera views like girls' locker room and stuff like on the internet. Anybody could watch this. And he's like, well, I like to watch the students while I'm away on travel. And we're like, huh? You do what? Well, first of all, what principal travels, and why do you got to watch the students when you're on travel? It's weird. But anyway, I guess there was a legitimate reason. And they took it off. So the mission accomplished. We made the world a little safer. They took it off the internet. It's not that hard to secure these. Take them off the internet, put them behind a two-factor VPN, limit the IPs that can go to them. It's like really basic, like IT security 101, basically, to lock a lot of these down. It's not really rocket science. So, we're out there, fighting the good fight, and that's awesome. It's just that there's a lot of it out there. There's a lot of help needed. There's a lot of need for this kind of security work. So one of the things that was weird about this system, and I encourage you to do this, if you've got a vendor and you've got a product you're interested in and you're taking a look at, go ahead and put the name of that product in the CVE search and see how many vulnerabilities that product has. That product had none. And it's like, whew, man, I feel better because I was starting to think that system was insecure. You know what I'm saying? But there's no CVEs, so I feel a lot better about that now. I'm good. I'm not good, right? That terrifies me. That means nobody cares. Nobody's reporting any vulnerabilities against that system. The vendor's not putting it back out to the community. They're not admitting when they're fixing bugs. They're not putting it, right? It's really bad. If you find 0 CVEs for a system like that, you got problems. That's not a good thing. So we thought, we'll take a little peek. We'll download the actual firmware. And the good news is the firmware is locked down. You can't download the firmware without like a user and pass. So that helps keep the firmware safe, which is good. Unless you do a little bit of Googling, you can probably find a user and pass and download the firmware anyway. Not that we would do that. I wouldn't do that. So let's pretend that there was a vulnerability in that system deeper than just default user and passwords, right? Now, I'm not saying there was, but, there could have been. Sometimes the researchers are hesitant to reach out to those vendors, right, for a lot of reasons. Like, do I want to waste my time? Are they going to blow me off? Are they going to call their lawyer out? There's still a lot of problems. A lot of vendors still haven't really fully embrace the idea of bug bounties and reaching out to the community or just simply having a secure@company.com on their website. Like, hey, if you find something, here's the email. We'll send you a t-shirt. We'll say thanks. Cool. Just do that. Like, right? Why would you not do that if you're a vendor? So do that. Please do that. That'll help people. That'll encourage people to find the right contact and report the right vulnerabilities, which we did for that system, by the way. The system's much safer now. And, again, the problem is it's not just that system, right? You can find other types of cameras, other types of systems. They're just on the internet. You watch a school bus drive by. You download the firmware. Once you download the firmware, you realize, man, there's a lot of these things on the internet. And when I tried to contact the vendor, this isn't me, this was some other researcher. He tried to contact a Chinese vendor about a IoT camera. And the vendor was like, we don't care. We don't fix vulnerability. We literally don't care. We're not going to fix that. And he's like, all right, well, I'm going to drop the vulnerability on the internet, which he did. So, and that's not good, right? That's kind of the worst case scenario. That's not how it's supposed to work. There's a better way. So one of my, encouragements there is to try to follow the better way. So, okay, so we saw a device on a pen test like that. What do you do? How does it work? How do you look into it? That's the kind of stuff that we sometimes do. Not just with that camera system, but with other types of systems as well. We've seen lots of different types of systems. We've seen solar panel type systems, and they're all over the internet. You can learn all about them, and you can find them on Shodan. And apparently, they've sold a lot of these, and you're on the device. and there's a default user and pass, and they're like all over the place. That's really bad. And you'll find that same thing with other types of things too. Like for example, we found this system with a broad SNMP sweep. It was a Taxenta 731, and we thought, what is that? We've never seen that before. We didn't know what it was. So we had to learn about it because the knowledge gap goes both ways, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to give this talk, was to encourage people that, you know, a lot of times the installers of equipment aren't security people, and security people aren't necessarily experts on, you know, HVAC systems either, right? Heating and cooling and stuff, which turns out this was part of a system like that. So part of what I want to do is encourage you to learn a little bit more outside of your normal domain and maybe learn something about some of these devices. So what's interesting about building controllers in particular is they used to be disparate systems, right? So like there was like a closed circuit camera system, wasn't on the internet, wasn't connected to anything. It was like that was the camera system, right? Same thing with the fire drill system and, you know, the maybe burglar alarm if a window was open and stuff. They were all just like kind of electronical, mechanical type systems. They weren't like internet systems, right? And the companies that built those things weren't cyber companies, okay? And then at some point we realized, man, it would be really cool if we could connect all those systems together, right? Like then we could have data about our whole building. We could tell from like a single pane of glass if a window's open or what's going on with the fire, or what's going on with a camera, like all to a single console. And we could maybe even do cooler things beyond that, like you could walk into a conference room and right from your mobile you could adjust the temperature or change the lighting or change the music, you know, it's like smart buildings, right? Like the idea of a true smart building has arrived, essentially. It's not in every building, but there are smart buildings out there. And a lot of the buildings, even if they don't have all that, they'll at least have some piece of that, right? Like the building controller and stuff like that that controls the heating and cooling. So really cool stuff, but kind of scary too if there's no security behind that. That could be a really bad thing if you know, if those things aren't being set up and installed correctly. And it's been a challenge for a lot of those companies that make that kind of stuff, right? Because they're not Google, they're not Microsoft. Those aren't the kind of companies that make electrical mechanical systems, right? It's other types of companies that traditionally didn't have to do a lot of cybersecurity or software security. So they've had to, you know, hire a head of, you know, a product security, chief product security architect or something. They've had to hire, you know, SDLC type engineers and people to like fuzz their building controllers and like stuff that was not part of their quality control before. But their quality control before was like, you know, connect pins and make sure that the circuit works right, and it was a different kind of quality, right? So they've had to change. So anyway, back to this device. Grabbed the manual for this device and read about it, and I read that the Taxenta is a highly secured mechanism. So I thought, man, I'm glad to know that, because I was concerned about the way we found it and where we found it and had, you know, default creds and stuff like that. Thought maybe this could be bad. But the manual says it's secure, so I'm convinced that that is in fact the case. And then if you read in one paragraph later, it says you need IE6 and a really old version of Java to connect to this thing, which makes me think one of these two isn't true, right? And I'm pretty sure I know which one of these two isn't correct, right? And that's really the problem there. So, oh man, so I went ahead and did that actually, installed an old version of Java and connected to it, and I found some more diagrams. And some of these diagrams are really scary because you can tell just from reading the diagram, it's like, oh, this is how you hook this to your building. You put this like backdoor modem on, and then you can connect to it from the internet, from home. You can like control the temperature of your building and stuff, and that would be cool. And you're like, oh man, wow, that's really crazy. So you have all this complicated stuff, and then you have a picture like that just kind of terrifies you, right, as a security engineer. Because you're like, I don't know what any of that other stuff is, but I know what that thing is. I know what the blue E means. That's the internet, right? That's the internet connecting to your building. So did a little research. I found out that according to Google, this is what an HVAC repair person looks like. I'm pretty sure that Google knows everything about that, so I guess that's what they look like. And again, you can find these things on the internet, and if you were to port scan them, you would find that they have services open, right? And if it's on the internet and it's connected to a building and it's running like an FTP server and a web server, it's like, why does that thing have to be on the internet? And why does it need like a web server and an FTP server? Well, probably that's how they update it. And I'm sure there's reasons, right? There's always reasons, but they're not necessarily good security reasons, right? reading the manual a little more on the user pass, besides the default user and pass, if they did happen to change the password, there's this code that if you forgot your password, you can give them that code and they can help you remember your password, which is nice because, people forget their password. But what's terrifying about that is so obviously there's a way to reverse engineer the way passwords are generated or something, right? Based on that hash. If you can get that, which you can get to it just by connecting to it. You don't have to authenticate to get that number, right? So that in and of itself looks a little worrisome. So what's weird about some of these systems is when you connect to them, the graphics of the UI look really bad. They're really cartoonish. They were written by some poorly written Java app from a long time ago, and they're they don't look very impressive. But what's scary about that is that even though it looks dumb when you look at the UI, it controls something real, right? So if you push the button, it's going to turn on the boiler or something, right? So be careful what you push if you actually connect to one of these. Don't mess around too much. So. Default password, log into one of these systems. It's got a bunch of options to look at different things like monitor the pool temperature of some building in Italy. Not that I would do that. You can download the Java applet. You could audit that, the client side rather than the server side if you want to go after that. A lot of old Java code. And the good news about this device though is when you do a CVE search for it, you'll find that it has lots of vulnerabilities, lots and lots of vulnerabilities for it. And I feel a little bit better about that. I'm not sure I feel a lot better about that than none, because there's lots of them, but at least they're doing something about it, right? Somebody's reporting them, they're getting fixed, they're reporting, they're putting it back out to the community. I kind of feel better about that, honestly, as weird as that may sound, to know that this thing has had known vulnerabilities that have been fixed. And like I said, the thing is, the problem with a lot of these things is they live a long time. So if you talk to the vendor and say, hey, your thing's insecure, they're like, no, this is the new version. That's what they should have in that building. And you're like, well, I get that, but that's not what they have. They have an old one that's on the internet. That's what they have, right? Maybe that's not what they should have, but that is what they in fact have. So that's kind of bad. The new diagram for the new machine looks kind of similar to the old one, but I guess it's more secure. They force you to change user and pass and stuff, which is good, right? So I think things have gotten better. There's still recent CVs against it, which is good, I guess, right? So they're still being reported, they're still being fixed. That's kind of a good thing. So whose problem is all that, right? Is it the manufacturer's fault? Is it the people who set it up that didn't set it up, change the password? That they call that the integrator, by the way. That's the term for that, right? Because usually the people who buy these, the facilities people for a building, they don't set them up. Your security department doesn't set them. It's the integrator that sets them up. So is it the integrator's fault? Is it the IT department's fault for not knowing what the facilities people are buying and setting up insecurely? Whose fault is that? Well, I talked to some people at JCI, really nice people, really good folks. Really appreciated the time I spent with them. And their director of product security, Jason, said that securing a smart building is a shared responsibility requiring focus and commitment from the manufacturer, integrator, and consumer. Which sounds like a commercial, but it's true. That's a good point. Basically, everybody involved has to, we can secure those. It's not rocket science. We've known how to secure those for 10 or 20 years, but we need to do it. So that's the thing that's not happening. So everybody has to kind of get involved. So it's more, I feel like, some of the biggest things that would make the biggest impact across the internet are the basic things, right? They're not like the super elite exploits that only, Uber people know about. It's no, we need to take things off the internet and, put passwords on them that aren't terrible and stuff like that. It's kind of the basic stuff. So for builders, the people making this stuff, it's secure design, it's coding, it's responsibly responding to events when they happen, it's forcing a product update, having some plan for how's this thing, because we know this thing's going to live 10 years, right? So we should make sure that we can update it in the field rather than just, preach at our customers that they should have bought the new one, right? There needs to be a better path than just that. So for the installers and the users, integrators, facilities, IT, they need to work together. They need to do basic things like segmentation. Does the building controller need to be on the same network as the domain controller? Probably not, right? Probably not a good thing, especially if that thing's on the internet. So segmentating, strong passwords, monitoring that. Oh, that'd be interesting. And you could even do one better than monitoring, and this would be really cool, and almost nobody does this, right? And that would be like a honeypot, right? So you could set up a fake building controller that looks like the old one with the default user and pass, and so when somebody tries it, it's like an immediate high-fidelity alarm to your SIM tool if you were actually looking for that and monitoring it, right? You would know instantly that somebody's trying to do something bad. You wouldn't get any false alarms out of that. When you look at a lot of the next-gen endpoint products out there, think of whichever vendor name you want to think of, a lot of them generate a lot of noise. It's like, oh my gosh, all my endpoints are getting attacked constantly all day long. No, not really. There's a lot of false positives out of those tools, right? So there's a lot of noise coming out of certain security tools. But if you had like a honeypot mimicking a building controller, nobody should ever try to log into that. It's not even real, right? So if somebody does, it's either like a security scanning tool or a pen tester, or it's a real attacker, right? It's only like one of three things, basically. So it's a pretty high fidelity alarm. So that would be really cool if you were actually monitoring that stuff, and I don't think too many companies are doing that. But if you were, instead of being behind the curve all the time, you could actually be ahead of the curve, and that would be really wild. Okay, and the last thing, I guess I didn't say it enough, but I'll say it one more time, just making sure that there's a way to update those things. And if you have to do it manually, that sucks, but a lot of those things, they don't update themselves. So like, when's the last time you updated your, cable modem router firmware? Like, maybe recently. A lot of people in here maybe have, right? Because we have a lot of technology people in here. But then it's like you think about your neighbor or your mom or your grandmother or whatever. It's like, they're probably not going to update their Xfinity thing that like came with the cable because the cable guy set it up, right? So you don't even know it's there. So a lot of that stuff, unless it updates itself, it's probably not going to get updated. And that's one of I really think that most IoT devices should update themselves. It's kind of scary because then there's pros and cons with that. You wonder, geez, do I really want this thing updating itself all the time? Maybe it'll take a bad patch and crash or something. And there is risk there. So it's a hard problem. And that's one of the things that, kind of an overviewing thing that we see in cyber is at its root, it's a hard problem, right? It's not something that we can really solve. We can get close, we can do better, and we should do better, but we can't really finally solve it. I mean, why haven't the fire department solved fire, and why hasn't the police solved crime, right? It's like, why haven't the IT security people solved security? It's the same kind of problem, really, at the end of the day. If somebody's going to phish somebody or something, it's a human crime. We really can't actually fully stop that, not completely. We can do better, though, and that's what this talk is about. It's kind of, let's do better. Let's see if we can do a little better. So, separations, VPNs, restrict by IPs, least privileges, a lot of the basics. If people just did that, they would be so much better off, and it would really make a difference. Yeah, I think I said all that. Physically secure, too, is important with these kind of devices. A lot of the sort of SCADA and building and all these sort of systems like that, a lot of times you can plug into them physically, right? So you walk up to a thermostat in an airport. If you look underneath it, a lot of times there's like an Ethernet jack. You can actually plug into that, and you'll be on the building network of the airport. And that's not a good thing. Really, random people shouldn't be able to get to that network. They should put like at least a little plastic thing with a lock over it or something, right? That somebody could still break it off with a baseball bat, but you'd probably see them do that in an airport, right? So at least having some control in place would be a good thing, particularly in public buildings. Otherwise, it's relatively easy to get on some of these specialized networks like the BACnet network without going into all the technical details of that. So, strong passwords, making sure your stuff's not findable on Shodan would be really good. Two-factor is huge, right? I mean, it's kind of outside the scope of this, but just having two-factor alone would stop so many different types of attacks. It's kind of a general thing. Secure update policy, I talked about that already. Because software, this is a little tagline for your execs in case they have a hard time understanding this stuff, but software decays over time, right? It's like milk or fruit or something like that. You build it, it's okay today. 6 months from now, there's a well-known CVE in what? In the product? Probably not. In what? In the third-party libraries that it's built on. Because why? Software is not really so much built nowadays as it is assembled, right? So like 98% of the code of your IoT camera, the people that made your IoT camera didn't write, right? They bought the lens, they bought the camera, and then they realized, oh, there's an image processing library on GitHub, there's this, there's that, there's this, it's being put together. And unlike food, there's no ingredients label on it, right? We don't get to see how many proteins and fats and carbs and stuff are in our IoT camera. It doesn't tell us. We can figure it out really easily. There's actually tools to do that. A lot of the component analysis tools can do that pretty easily. You can identify the third-party libraries inside a product. But we don't do that. Not very often. Not very many people do. But if you did, you'd find out that pretty rapidly software decays. Again, you'd find that in 6 months there's a couple, in a year there's like 10, in 18 months there's like 20, and 3 years later there's like 100 well-known vulnerabilities in your product, basically, just based on known vulnerabilities in third-party libraries. I gotta grab some water, sorry. Okay, so what do we do about that? Well, part of that is, again, it's everybody's problem. You could do that, you could check that as the buyer. But really, I feel like the builders should be heavily involved in that, right? They should understand that. They should have a way to train their developers to make sure their developers understand at least those basic things, and most of them do. Developers are pretty smart. I think I've always had good experiences with developers. They're generally pretty smart, but a lot of times they don't have budget or they don't have manager's approval. Or I remember talking to some developers one time who were secretly doing security. He's like, man, I want to learn more about fuzzing, but my boss literally told me we're not allowed to spend time on security because it's not in the budget. He literally doesn't want me doing it. So I do it. I'll stay late sometimes and do it anyway behind his back. I'm like, that's messed up. That's messed up. That's really weird. That's really messed up. I think that's fairly rare. I think that wouldn't happen in most cases, but I have certainly heard of stuff like that, right? And so that's not good. So having a company that's willing to invest and build that positive culture and reward their employees and saying, hey, not only do we want you to do security, but if you take that class or go to that conference or learn more about it, you're going to be first in line when it's time for a raise or a promotion or whatever it is, right? Because you obviously care. You're one of our leading engineers who knows a lot about security. That's a good thing. Okay, so secure by design. And understanding how's the system going to be used, how can we reduce the attack surface, right? What does that mean? That means taking all those features and going, yeah, we need this, this, and this, but this thing that a lot of our users want and stuff, like, they don't need that. We're just going to take that out. We're not going to build that in. And honestly, sometimes we in the security community, we're guilty of that at times. When are we guilty of that? Well, if you've ever been kind of in the IT security blue team side, a lot of times what IT security people do is they're proud of this too. They know how to drive their vendors, right? They know how to get free dinners out of their vendors. They know how to, make sure their vendors cuts them a deal and gives them 20% off software. And they know how to kind of squeeze. And they ask for a lot of features, right? Hey, we love your tool, but it's missing this, and this, right? If it had that, then we'd buy it. Okay, well, we're going to add that real quick for this guy because he's a big buyer. Okay, it's not all bad, but we got to be a little bit careful with that, right? Because every time we add a feature, we do what? We increase the attack surface, right? And security products are just like any other product. They have vulnerabilities in them, whether we like to talk about that or not. I think sometimes the security community doesn't like to talk a lot about vulnerabilities in their own security products, but we see it quite a bit, right? So that's something that we need to be really careful with. And then obviously, how do we build our code so that these components can be easily updated? If we find out in 6 months that there's a CVE in our image processing library that we built into our IoT camera, did we do that in a way that's easily updatable? Because if it is, that's good. We can just update it, and we can ship a new version of our firmware securely, right? And automatically, maybe not. But either way, we can do that. But if what we did when we built that camera is we took piece of that library out and we kind of stuck it in our product, but we didn't take the whole thing. We just took the bit that we wanted. Now it's really hard to update that, right? Because whenever there's a vulnerability in this library, it's like, well, you get into this discussion, and I've had a lot of these discussions with vendors, companies, teams, developers, whatever. They're like, yeah, your component analysis tool says that we're vulnerable to 100 things, but we don't think we really are. We're pretty sure that the way we use that library, we don't actually use those portions of it. That's fine. It's an awkward conversation to have because basically it's the sort of prove it to me conversation, right? It's like until you can, POC me with an exploit, I don't really believe that this is vulnerable, which maybe they're right, but maybe they're wrong, right? And that's really the problem. So ideally, if we can avoid that whole conversation and that whole battle and that whole sort of time sink, if we can just make sure that it's easy for us to update our product with whatever libraries we depend on, and that'll help a lot. So all those things are what we call security best practices. And there's a lot of other security best practices like, this medical system that takes x-rays of your brain or whatever, it runs on Windows XP SP1. That's scary, right? It takes an x-ray of my brain, you know what I mean? Should it be on Windows 10 at least? There's DEP and there's ASLR and you can sandbox the process and stuff like that. That would be better. Wouldn't that be better? How many of you been to the doctor and noticed that the nurse is logging into an XP machine? You're like, I don't feel real good about that. I don't feel good about that at all. So that's not necessarily a good thing. And there's a lot of other relatively simple things besides running on a modern operating system, like static code analysis, like having, dynamic analysis fuzzing, automated testing, all is part of your continuous integration, right? It's all sort of like security 101, but a lot of the companies that make these kind of products, they're not Google, they're not Microsoft, they're not cyber companies, right? They don't have the budget and staff for this, so it's a struggle. Making sure that they have all the right things like security and some accountability, which is what? Accountability is not blaming the person who made the vulnerability. It's more why did we have that vulnerability in our product? Like, where did we mess up? Like, we didn't pay enough for training, or we didn't hire the right people, or we just didn't, that API was confusing. What was it about our development, process that led to that vulnerability? And how can we not just address that, but how can we address all of the vulnerabilities of that category so that the whole thing is more secure just in general? Like taking care of whole classes of bugs. A lot of big vendors have been doing that recently, right? Like Microsoft and stuff like that. When they find a use after free in IE, they don't just fix that one. They think about how can we find all these, right? And sometimes it's hard and sometimes they can't, but they try, right? And I think that others aren't trying. So the other thing you can do for this whole thing is, again, it might sound basic, but put it under the purview of the IT security department and find a security department partner just like you would for your domain, right? So you're pen testing your domain. Why aren't you pen testing the thing that could burn down your building, right? You know what I mean? Like, think about that, right? We'll pen test our domain server, but we won't pen test the thing that could burn down our building. It doesn't really make sense. So we need a partner there too. And as I talked about some of the fancier things, like for builders, you could hide your firmware so it's harder to find on the internet. For users, you can do some of the cyber deception stuff I was talking about, like with Canary and stuff. So I think I mentioned all that. The whole logging and making sure that logs go to the SIM tool. I mentioned all that already. I'm just kind of running through that. But deception, I'm really a big fan of that. I think in the future we'll probably see more of that than what I was talking about before, where you kind of make a fake system that looks like something, sort of some cyber deception, right? Because why not? It's cheap, it's easy. There's systems out there, actually. There's a tool called Canary. I'm not like a rep for that company or anything. I'm not necessarily saying you should buy that one. But there's a lot of products like that that can easily replicate and look like a vulnerable system of one side to the other, so that you can, in your SOC, get high fidelity alarms, which we don't get a lot of in the SOC sometimes. Sometimes the SOC gets a lot of false alarms, and that makes that job harder. They need some good alarms too. Okay, so starting to wrap up, just giving you a picture of how complex it really is just to secure one thing, just a building, just a smart building, right? The external stakeholders, the people that need to be involved in that process, there's like at least 8 of them, right? And then without reading through them and going through them painstakingly slow, like for internal stakeholders, there's another 8, right? So there's at least 16 people or parties or organizations that have to be involved in trying to keep just one thing like a building safe and secure. And that's really hard. It's a hard problem. But it's really exciting, right? The field we work in is hard, but it's really exciting. I love what we do. Sometimes, it can be a little disappointing. Like I recently talked to the VP of a major bank, and he's like, man, I miss the days of like when the auditor came and he looked through my papers and he could find out that we bounced some checks wrongly or something, but like I didn't have to deal with cyber. I don't want to learn cyber. I'm too old to learn cyber. Like this guy was just like not in for cyber, right? And that's not a good thing. That's a little bit scary if you have an exec in your company that kind of has that mindset that doesn't want to learn new things. That's not going to be good. So yes, security is hard. Your networks, your products, they're all at risk as much as ever. But I want to leave you with encouraging words that it is possible to secure them. It takes passion, it takes diligence, it takes commitment from everybody involved. It takes best practices like safe, design and coding and development, monitoring and response, right? Because we can't catch all the bugs here, but maybe we'll catch them over here, right? So those multiple layers, all the things we've talked about for a long time, it is possible to do them. So I want to thank you guys for listening. There's the Twitter, mine and my company's, and website. And if you want to email me, or if you have any questions now, I'll take them. But thank you very much for coming and listening. So I think the question, if I heard you right, is if you scanned for, let's say, particular cameras or something you found on the internet, would it be possible to contact those individuals? Because they might be individuals, they may not be companies in every case. Could you contact them? Should you? And what would they say if you did? I think that's a hard problem. I don't think a lot of people have tried to do that in every case, right? Sometimes they might do it, particularly if it's their customer or, I think people are doing that onesie-twosie, but to just try to reach out to some guy in Iowa that has a camera on the internet, who knows what kind of result you're going to be met with, right? You might call the police on you or something, right? Yeah. I actually have done that in one case. So one time we were doing a pen test, and I ended up finding the camera system to local jail, to the sheriff's department, and was able to. It was the ladies' jail too, right? And we could see in, like inmate cells, all that stuff. And so I did. I called my local FBI contact, and I was like, "Hey, how do I like let them know without me ending up like in there with them and stuff like that, that their cameras are on the internet?" And he's like, "Just call them. It'll be fine. Give them a call." So I'm like, all right. So I gave him a call, and I get like 911 dispatch. And I'm like, hey, it's not you, it's me. You know, try to give him this whole story, explain this technical thing, right? It's kind of hard to explain that to somebody that's not necessarily technical. And they're like, oh, well, let me transfer you to the jailmaster. So he transfers me to the jailmaster, and the jailmaster listens to my whole story, and he's like, well, what are you seeing through camera 6 right now? I'm like, I don't know. It looks like a deputy like rocking his chair, picking his nose or whatever. He's like, that's Phil. You really are looking at our cameras. He got all excited about it. And he's like, yeah, we'll get on that. We'll fix that for you. It's not a problem. So, I mean, in that case, they were cool. I don't know that every case would go like that, but at least in that case, they were cool about it. Yeah. Good question. I didn't know. Sorry. Somebody probably should, though. You should do that. Yeah. So there's at least a couple that I know of. I actually like the one by Synopsys. They have one called Protocode that I think works pretty well. It's pretty awesome, actually. You just take any executable, any zip file, any kind of package thing, you drop it, and it basically tells you you have 100 CVEs in this product. And it's not necessarily accurate, right? Because it's just giving you that data based on known CVEs and based on the components that are in your thing. So it's not necessarily 100% accurate. What I like about it, though, is you can get data over time. And you can tell that this thing over time is getting better, it's getting worse, like the vendor doesn't care, they don't know. Like you can get some insight even though it's not complete. It gives you a piece of the picture, yeah.
So this hits really close to home for me because I actually used to be a security integrator, and now I'm in IT security, so I've actually done a handful of deep dives into, I'm just working for a consumer company, I'm not a vendor of any sort. So I've done some deep dives into just the systems that we use that I literally use to install. But as far as the analysis of these things, other than just what little skill set that I have at this point, who do you see? Are you seeing people out there that will do these assessments, or is this a gap in the market? Is this something that you call somebody like a Black Hills or a Guardians or whatever? Or
Yeah, no, I mean, we do that. I mean, we can definitely do those assessments, and there are certainly plenty of others that would and will as well. The problem is that in many cases they're just not happening. Corporate, they know they need to pen test the corporate, and it still hasn't quite dawned on them they ought to be pen testing other things too. That was really one of the points I was making, so yeah. Any other questions? Okay, thanks guys. You know what? I don't have a card on me. I gave them all, but I do have my Jacob on. Oh, really?
Oh, okay. We have a. I'll not do that. We have a converter in one of the rooms. I'll see if I can find it.
I can do. You know what? I think I have one for that. I just, it's usually better if you have an HDMI, I go straight to HDMI. But if not, then I can. Right.
Oh, you just meant it.
But if this is what there is, this works. I just. All right, that sounds good. Good. All right. Well, first off, thank you guys for showing up to like the last talk of the day. I know it's kind of late. I'll go through this kind of fast. I won't cut anything out, but I might just go a little faster, just so we can go have some fun earlier. This talk, like the title says, is about digital vengeance, and we will be doing some exploits. I have some exploits for some rats that basically the premise of this talk. I don't feel like these exploits are anything amazing or exciting. Well, I mean, they're exciting, but I don't think they're like, oh, this is novel. I think the biggest takeaway I hope you can get from this talk is that these exploit kits, or the rats that a lot of these actors use, are highly vulnerable, and if anybody's interested in this kind of work, this is a very ripe field for the picking. So if you come away with anything, I hope that's the message that I can share by the end of this talk. A little bit about myself. I've been in the IT, or information security world for over 10 years. I work for Symantec right now, but before that I worked for a 3-letter agency, and even before that I'd done some time in the trenches. I was an IT administrator, so I know what it's like to try to manage these networks. I feel like I have a kind of a broad perspective on this issue. So with that background, it shouldn't come as a surprise that there are some disclaimers. First off, my opinions or anything I'm voicing up here represents my own opinion and not my current or former employers. Second off, if you go get in trouble with what I'm about to say, don't blame me, right? These can be used for a lot of fun, maybe, but it's probably illegal. And then the last part of this is that, yeah, just use it at your own risk. Can backfire. You might get somebody retaliating. You don't know. We don't know really what could happen, right? This is a lot of uncharted territory for the most part. So let me tell you a little bit about what got me started on this topic, and that is the term the sophisticated actor, right? We hear that in the news all the time, that this place was compromised by such and such an actor, or like there's nothing that they could have done. Like there's this one quote by the FBI there. They're like, oh, their defense is, would have got past 90 of us, so don't feel bad. Like, no. This defeatist attitude, like, oh, they were sophisticated. We couldn't defend ourselves against that. That is very demeaning to us as a security industry, and it really bothered me. I mean, I'm not even sure what the term sophisticated actor is trying to persuade, right? Like, you go to your CEO and like, what happened? Oh, we were hacked. Really? How'd they get in? Oh, they were sophisticated. The CEO kind of, how do you know they were sophisticated? Well, they were wearing a monocle, so we clearly know that they were sophisticated. It's like, what? This doesn't say anything. It really, it's just one of those terms that people kind of throw out there as a blanket. And so that's kind of the point of this talk. I wanted to show that these sophisticated actors aren't really that sophisticated, and that they could actually be hacked back. So, hacking back, right, is a very hot topic at the moment, and truth is, it's probably going on whether we like it or not. At Black Hat, 5 years ago, they did a survey which showed about 1/3 of the people that they surveyed admitted anonymously that they have engaged in some form of hacking back, right? It's very prevalent, whether or not many say it or not. There was a recent article that came out that said a bank of some sort elicits hacking back. But nobody wants to come forth and say that they do it. It's just somebody's doing it, and nobody wants to admit to it. Then we bring up Tom Greaves, the senator out of Georgia, has drafted a bill known as the ACDC Act. I love the acronym, which is the Active Cyber Defense Certainty Act, which basically is allowing hacking back. If it were to pass, then that's what the bill is allowing. And people really kind of, the general census is hacking back's probably not a good idea, right? First off, it's illegal, or most likely it's illegal in our current situation. But second off, what can you gain from hacking back? You can't really like steal your documents back, right? Like any Hollywood movie star who's had photos leaked knows that. And we should, as IT people, know that you just can't steal something back. You might be able to like revenge, like that's what everybody's like, oh, we'll get them back. The best you could do is maybe brick their machine and then they go hop on a different one, right? Like there's not much there that you can really gain. And you have more to lose. First off, if you hit the wrong box, you've got a liability on your case. You might ruin your reputation if it finds out that you were hacking back. Not to mention the lost time that you could have been repairing what was actually hacked in the first place. You're spending off on some escapade that's probably not going to buy you much. And then what if it leads to escalation? What if you do happen to get back into them, but then they catch you and they decide to hack you back again, right? Like this back and forth probably is not going to win you very much. And that's kind of my general thought here, is that revenge hacking is not fruitful and not worth it. But that's not what the AC/DC Act is proposing. In fact, the AC/DC Act strictly prohibits hacking back for the purpose of destroying or causing physical or financial injury to the attacker. Instead, it says you can hack back for the purpose of establishing attribution or monitoring behavior of an actor. And I work as a security researcher, and so that's where I feel like the strongest use for hacking back is. Attribution is hard, but if you're able to watch or monitor the actor, that can provide a lot of valuable insight to attribution. And so this is where I feel like the best use of hacking back is, not for revenge, as many people feel like is necessary. Now, obviously, you didn't come here to hear me talk about laws or ethics or what I think is right. The talk here is about exploits. So I'm going to step aside from the whole ethics and legal issues and basically say, were that law to pass, this is what we could be capable of doing today. All these exploits that I'm going to discuss just recently got them pushed through Meterpreter or Metasploit. So you can, if you pull down the recent Metasploit image, you have these exploits already, and you can go play with them yourselves. Before I start, I do want to get some terminology clear, because in some worlds I've heard the client piece of a rat and the server piece of a rat used back and forth, and I'm going to try to use the terms in one version and stick to that here so that we don't confuse anybody. The original target or victim from a rat, I'm going to call the target, right? That is the person that was being attacked first. The attacker, the one that has the C2 command and control piece, I'm going to refer to as the adversary in this case. I can't call them the attacker because we're quickly going to become the attacker, and then it gets kind of confusing who's who. They become a victim. And then the term I choose for the person doing the hacking back is retaliator. I really like that one, mainly because it lets me have RAT, which is nice for rats. But retaliator, if you look it up in the dictionary, it's one who returns assault in kind, and that's basically what we're going to be doing here. So I was like, yeah, I like that term. How I started with this is a good friend of mine. He took all the APT reports that have been released, and he just kind of ran some statistics on them, and he tweeted this out a while ago, and this is really what got myself thinking about it. He said, these are the top 10 most referenced tools in all the APT reports, right? So he kind of did a tally and said, these are the ones that come up the most. And so I was like, okay, well, let's just start at the top of that shopping list and work our way down. And so I worked my way, I did 3, and figured, that's good enough. But if you'll notice, the one at the top of that list is poison ivy. And truth be known, there's already an exploit for poison ivy out there. This one is done by those individuals at the bottom. I'm not going to try to say their name because I would just murder it. But they came up with a remote exploit against the poison ivy server. And more interesting, at least to me, was that after Mandiant came out with the APT1 report, a group known as Malware LU noticed that they were using poison ivy, and so they attacked APT1 back, broke into their infrastructure, was able to monitor them, they were able to pull tools that they were using, and then they were able to reverse them and find out more information about how this hacker works. This image, the far one on the left, shows the infrastructure they uncovered, and they documented this whole thing and released it out there. This is one of the rare cases where somebody hacked back and then is actually talking about it. And I think it's amazing because what they found provided better signatures for this attacker. It let us know what tools they use, how they do their infrastructure, and kind of what they do behind the scenes. It was very insightful information. So it's kind of actually a good proof that this is very useful information. Another one on that top 10 list that was already popped was Dark Comet. Again, these two found a remote file disclosure vulnerability. I don't know of anybody publicly using this one. I'm sure it is, but nobody's talked about it publicly. But I just had to kind of, fair disclosure, these two had already been popped, so I kind of excluded them from my list. And now, instead of working from the way down, I'm going to talk about them as least interesting to most interesting. So here's the new stuff. Number 4 on the list, or the third one I looked at, is Extreme Rat. Extreme Rat, anybody familiar with Extreme Rat? Yeah, it's not one of the more common ones. It was the bottom one on my list. It's actually targeted more toward a script kiddie type. If you see, so this is the rat command and control piece, and I have one victim there, and I've right-clicked on the victim, and that's the pop-up menu showing me like what I can do to the victim, right? You can see, you can run commands on them, you can take their passwords, you can use them as a proxy, a lot of the basic command and control type things. The script, like I said, this kit is geared towards script kiddies. One of the features in it is it's got built-in games. So if you're bored waiting for your phishing email to come back, you can play some Jewel Quest or something while you're waiting. It's really, I thought that was kind of funny. But just despite this, it has been referenced in a lot of sophisticated actor reports. Shoot, my Gaza Strip there, Israel. A lot of Middle East areas, you see a lot of activity with this kit. So it is used in a lot of these sophisticated actor groups. And easy way to identify Extreme Rat is how it beacons home. If it does a TCP call home, it always calls home with this string, my version, pipe, and then the version, 3.6, 3.7, 3.8. And the server responds with an X, right? That's a very fingerprintable traffic. If you've got snort or anything, you can fingerprint this and easily detect this type of traffic in this rat. Alternatively, it can try to mask as an HTTP request when it calls home, but it just does this HTTP GET and then it reverts back to a raw TCP section. So it's not even real HTTP. And furthermore, the request takes the form of get some number dot functions. And that number is the passcode that the Extreme Rat user enters when they start it up. The passcode has to be all numeric, and it can't be longer than 10 digits. So it's always some numbers dot functions. If you see a request for some numbers dot functions, it's probably Extreme Rat, and you might want to investigate further. So I started looking at this rat, and I started enumerating its capabilities, and I observed how it worked, looking for vulnerabilities. And one of the first things I saw was how it does a remote upload to the target. So when the adversary wants to load a file on the target's machine, it'll send a message and say, hey, get ready to receive my file tool.bad.exe, and I want you to save it to this folder named, calc.exe. And then the target responds back, okay, I'm ready to receive your file /tool.bad.exe, and then it sends the data. Now, what's interesting here is the target doesn't need to know where the adversary is saving that file locally. Like, I don't need to know what you call it and where you save it. Why are you telling me this information? That was like a little information disclosure, but nothing big. But then I thought, well, the only reason it would really be telling the target is so that when the target responds, it didn't have to keep any state. It didn't have to remember, I've told you to make this request. In fact, it just needs to be ready for the second command. And so that made me think, well, do I even need the first one? What if I just got rid of that and send it this message, say, hey, I'm ready to receive tool.bad. Sure enough, the server responds with, oh, okay, here it is. Here's the file. And so I could ask for whatever file I want, and it will hand it to me. So now I just need to know what do I want to ask for. Now, I can't ask for a directory. That would be nice. But so this is called a blind file retrieval vulnerability, and pen testers are familiar with this. This is something they can come up with. And so this is some suggestions based on a pen tester site thing, right? You want to pull win.ini. That's on any Windows system. It's just kind of a sanity check just to make sure things are working. If you can pull that, then we know things are good. But then after you pull that, you would probably get a good idea of what version of Windows you're running, which can lead you to know where the event files are. So you can pull the event files. Now, if you pull the event files, you might be able to figure out the usernames, right? Because a username usually shows up in an event file by one chance. If you pull the user's desktop.ini, then you can get the names of folders on that person's desktop and files on that person's desktop, which may give you more things you want to start pulling. Alternatively, if they're running as admin, which probably happens more than not, you can pull the SAM backup so you can get their passwords, or you can pull the registry and get a whole lot more information about maybe interesting files. This link at the bottom gives you some kind of ideas of things you can pull with a blind file retrieval. So that was the first one. Second up on my list is Core Plug, or PlugX, or Distore. Anybody familiar with this one? This one's a little more common. It's very popular in Asia. It is, I don't know, everybody in Asia seems to be a sophisticated actor, but this then has been only used by sophisticated actors or APT groups. Again, I have one victim there, and this pop-up window in the front is showing me what capabilities I can do on that victim. It's a little bit more feature-rich. I can edit the registry, do a net capture, I can capture the keyboard, transfer files. Some interesting ones on there was it has functionality for SQL server, so you can regularly access an SQL server on the victim. It's a little bit more feature-rich. It's a very popular one in Asia. It's been around for a number of years, and it's been cited in even more nation-state attacks. Again, a lot of these out of Asia. Some of the better papers that I know you want to unplug me, or I know you want me unplugging PlugX. That one was given at Black Hat Asia, and it was a very good talk. They outlined the different variants of this malware family and how it works, and that provided me a good start at where to look for exploits. But this one, as I was looking for exploits, here's my obligatory IDA screen. I have to have one of those in there. This is a section of code when it's getting a packet back from the victim, or excuse me, the target. And basically, it just checks that the packet is small enough to fit in the buffer that it's allocated. And if it's not, then it'll show this error message. However, this particular piece of code that checks that the packet's not too big comes after it's already copied the packet onto the buffer. So it's a little too late at that point. Here you see the mem copies, and then down at the bottom where it says decode packet, that's where it actually does the checking if the header was, checking if the size was small enough to fit, after it's already done the mem copy. So I thought that was cute, that's nice. And so when you overflow it, you get this very descriptive error message telling the adversary what just happened, right? Like PE decode packet. Very, very clear. Furthermore, this is kind of like a generic error message. It doesn't just happen in this case. Like if you just nmap the server, it will pop one of these messages. This message is just kind of the, I don't know what happened, boss, but something just happened. And so this message is here. Now the bad thing is in the code flow, the adversary has to acknowledge this message in some way. I don't care how. They can hit the X or they can hit the OK button. But as soon as they acknowledge it, then I get code execution. But we have to wait for this annoying little message to traverse its course. So I have a demo of this recorded just in case it didn't work. How I've got this set up, the left side of the screen is the retaliator, and the right side of the screen is the adversary. I've got Metasploit running on the left side there. I'm going to start this up. All right, so I start up the PlugX rat at the adversary's machine. And then on the attacker, I'm just going to go ahead and fire up my exploit. This is my exploit for PlugX. I assume I know where it's at. We'll talk more about how you can find out where your adversary's IP is. There's 3 different versions. I'm going to pause this for just a second. There's 3 different versions of PlugX out there in the wild, and so I have the 3 versions there under the available targets type. You can try each one and do the check command and it'll tell you this one looks like it's right, or no, it's not this one, try a different one. And so it's not going to do any harm to do the check. So you find the right one before you actually throw your exploit, but that's just a FYI there. So I do a check, yep, it says this target appears vulnerable. We'll throw our exploit against the server. There's the pop-up message, and as soon as they acknowledge this in some way, you'll see my interpreter session spinning up. I'm taking a second for a minute. I'm going to do a sysinfo just to gain basic info of the target, and then as more as a visual proof, I think I'm going to spawn, I'm going to spawn Notepad there on the victim's machine. There you go. Wrong button, wrong button. All right, last on my list is Ghost Rat. Anybody familiar with this one? Yeah, hands go up. This thing's been around for almost over a decade. It's been around for over 10 years. It was originally written by the CRST hacker team, another Chinese group. This thing is like been the gold standard for rats. Like everybody has, can you do what the Ghost Rat can do? Because that's kind of what everybody's used to. Again, I have one victim, right click, those are the options you have. Very standard set of features there. This one is highly cited. It's been around, like I said, for over 10 years and has been used in a lot of very high-profile attacks. In fact, even most recently, it was used in March. It was being spread by Eternal Blue exploit. So, old bug, or an old tool, but still a go-to favorite for them. It's very easy to spot, despite that. It always calls home with this magic 5-byte ghost and then a compressed buffer. And the ghost is spelt with a 0. Now, a while ago, the source code of this was leaked. And so we start to see variants where they change that magic bytes to try to hide out their code, but they usually leave it as 5 bytes and just change it to some 5 other bytes, which is still a very unique pattern. A good colleague of mine, these are, the second page down there is a list of different variants that he's seen in the wild. One of those is 6 characters. The rest of them are all 5-character variants of this. And like I said, it's very easy to spot this guy in the wild. And this guy, very similar to Extreme Rat, had that same kind of vulnerability where it didn't validate the information that the victim was passing it, the target was passing it. But this one was in the file retrieval. So when the adversary wants to get a file off the victim's site, then it says, hey, I want you to give me your file.doc so I can save it to my repository.doc. And then sure enough, the victim says, okay, here's the data, so you can save it to this path. And we can always, like I said before, leave that first request out and just say, oh, by the way, here's this data. You requested it to be saved in startup. Yeah, here it is. And so, you know, we can do that. And unfortunately, that requires a reboot. And it doesn't always work on Windows, right? Because different versions of Windows have different locations for the startup file. So if you know the version of Windows, you could do that. But I wanted something that worked a little better. I had a personal vendetta against Ghost, and so I wanted something better than that. So I noticed another vulnerability, and that is that there's a sideload vulnerability for Ghost. If you set the file oli-debug or oli-dlg in the same directory as Ghost, which is the default when you want to save something, then it will next time Ghost starts up, it will try to load that file. And it's looking for just one exported function in that file known as oli UI busy. It's basically just asking, hey, do you mind if I make the UI busy? And almost always when it calls it, the answer is true. So if you just make a DLL that exports that one function and returns true, then Ghost will load happily, and you can then backdoor the back door, which is really kind of fun. So you can make a DLL, have that one function, put your backdoor in that DLL, and then say, oh, here's oli-dlg, you requested that file, just save it in your local working directory. And it will do that, and then the next time Ghost starts up, you get execution. But that then requires a reboot. So I kept looking. I wanted something better. And I found something, actually. This is 2 lines of code. Since the source code was out there, it made reverse engineering a lot easier. I didn't need to decompile it. It was already out there. We see here that they are memsetting a remote drive list. This is listing the drives the remote PC has, so like A, C, D, Z, whatever. They set that to 0, and then they copy into that buffer the buffer they received from the victim or the target. But you'll notice that they don't check that that buffer is smaller than the buffer they expected. There's only going to be 27 drives, right? So I don't need to check this buffer. It's always going to be less than 1,000. Well, I can make up a lot more drives than 27. And so I overwrite this C++ class. Now, the fields you overwrite is, like you saw earlier, the remote drive list, which is 1,024 characters. So that gives me a huge buffer to write my shellcode in, and then I got to overwrite something below that to get execution. What I chose is one of those images down below. That is a pointer to another class. If you're familiar with exploitation, that means you have a pointer to a pointer that you have to control. It's kind of nasty because then you don't know where you are in memory. So you need a reliable way to end up somewhere. I took the lazy man's approach, and I just did a heap spray, so I knew I was just about everywhere. And then with good probability, I would land in my code execution area. DEP data execution would prevent this attack from working. However, in all of my tests, Ghost Rat Server does not even work if DEP is enabled. So I didn't have to defeat that one because the code defeats it for me. Before I showed the demo of that exploit, I do want to talk about some other cool things that I've seen done that are related, and that is Kevin the Hermit has a lot of decoders for the malware. If you found a piece, or if you've been targeted with this malware, then you can take one of these decoders and run it against your malware, and it'll say, oh, this piece of malware was configured to call home to this address. And so you get the C2 information of the target based on the malware sample. Or if you're too lazy or you just don't want to wait until you're targeted, there's always Shodan. Shodan recently added the malware hunter, and Ghost is one of the malware rats that it hunts for. So if you wanted, you could just search Shodan and get it down. And with that, I have a demo here. Again, left side is the retaliator, right side is the attacker. This time I'm going to play it out like I was targeted. So the adversary I'm going to generate a payload, and I'm going to deliver that to my target. I generate it and I save it to the desktop, and then I kind of mess up here and close the rat because I don't know why. Now, typically it's delivered via phishing email or whatever watering hole, whatever attack method you want. Here, I just dragged it over out of the VM, and so now I have it down here, and I'm going to run that script by Kevin the Hermit against my sample and extract the C2 information. And there it shows the IP address and the port that the C2 server is listening on, that sample was configured to use. So I'm going to spin up Metasploit, use my module, target my adversary. It'll take me just a minute to do that. Oh, I noticed I wasn't running the rat, so I started that back up too. Just make sure everything looks good. I think I'll do a check. Yep, appears vulnerable, and we'll run the exploit. Now, because I'm doing a heap spray, it's taking a little while to fill up the memory. So it'll take a second to send enough copies of my shellcode over there until I feel comfortable. And then it will throw the exploit. And there it goes, coming right back. I have my session spinning up. I'll do the same kind of thing, do a sysinfo, and then I think wow, the session's taking a second. There it goes. There's the session, sysinfo, and then I'll spawn, calc, and pop calc. So we got execution on a number of very high-profile toolkits of these sophisticated actors. And the question is, then what? What do you do? I'm not sure. But I would suggest these are some good commands that might provide some great information. First off being netstat. Netstat will show you all connections on that machine, meaning if they've pwned anybody else, netstat will show the connections inbound from their other victims. So you can see who else was targeted, or maybe if your other machines in your internal infrastructure that have been exploited. It will also show if there's any RDP connections into the box. Maybe they're not live on this box, maybe they're just remote connecting into it. Maybe you want to walk the file system, see if they've pulled any files from you, or if they pulled any files from any other victims. It will gain very valuable information into what they're looking for, what they're targeting, what are they after. Right? That kind of intel is very valuable to your IT teams and security teams, not just yours, but globally. Maybe you'll want to install your own persistent so you can hang around, maybe install your own keylogger so you can see what they're up to, see what else they like to do, or maybe you want to just rip their credentials and start pivoting through their own network. It's all very interesting. All very, I think this is an area that hasn't really been flushed out, or if it has, the people that have flushed it out aren't talking about it. So I think that's something we should discuss, especially before it becomes illegal to hack back. We ought to talk about what we're going to do when we get on there first. But whatever you decide to do, I highly recommend that it's not revenge, and that it's you lie back and you watch. Right? The quieter we are, the more we can learn about our adversary, and the better prepared we are to evade their attacks. So with that brings me to the end. I appreciate you guys hanging around late on this opening day. If you have questions, I have plenty of time for questions. If you want to go party, I totally understand. But thank you very much. Yes? Yes. So if I understood you correctly, you want to inoculate the victim, the target machine, so that they can't get in initially, and then you can attack back when you see that.
But the attack back is automated.
Oh yes, yeah. It would be. I mean, you could easily. A lot of these you can easily to detect the traffic, even if you. I mean, you could inoculate the host. For me, it would be easier, just how I think, to detect the beaconing traffic, and you cut that line and start your own beacon and back to home and take control. Yes, it could be very automated. That'll be interesting to just find out, oh, you got a shell today.